His hand hovered a breath from her skin, a warmth that preceded the touch, promising and denying in the same suspended gesture. The air in the hall caught in the court's lungs, but for Ilara, the entire world was reduced to that minimal space between his fingers and the curve of her face. A universe of silence where his gaze stripped her of the courage she had worn like armor. And the question that did not come in words but in the darkening of his irises was an abyss. Before we dive into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. Blackstone Castle breathed a cold that came from the stones themselves, a breath of ages that time could not warm. Ilara felt it in her bones, a persistent dampness that seeped through the cracks of her status as an outsider, a displaced piece in the machinery of that imposing house, an orphan of a name that no one there bothered to remember. She was merely the hands that polished the silver, the shadow that glided through the corridors before the sun dared to touch the sleeping gargoyles. Her days were woven in silence, her only inheritance, a silence she had learned to use as a cloak, dense and protective, where her thoughts could flourish without being crushed by the disdainful glares of Lady Beatrice or the sharp voice of Cale, the steward, whose loyalty to the lady of the house was a blade always sharpened against the servants. Ilara did not belong in that place, and the castle itself seemed to whisper this to her with every gust of wind that whipped the windows of the North Tower, where her tiny room was nestled like an abandoned nest. She was an observer of the stained glass windows that bled pale colours onto the marble floor at dusk, of the tapestries that narrated battles of dead kings whose faces seemed to contort in silent agony, of the way the dust danced in the solitary beams of light that invaded the library. It was in the library that she found refuge, a sanctuary with the sweet smell of paper and leather, where unspoken words weighed more than those spoken. There, among the books she was not allowed to read but could touch under the pretext of dusting them, she felt a little less invisible. Her fingers, thin and pale, traced the worn spines as if reading in braille the stories contained within. And her heart, a frightened bird, dared to beat at an almost serene rhythm. That morning, the mist clung to the walls like a desperate lover. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and coming snow. Ilara was polishing the great oak table in the dining hall, a task that required slow, circular movements, a forced meditation. Each turn of her cloth revealed the distorted reflection of her own face, a pale smudge with large, haunted eyes. She focused on the rhythmic sound of the fabric against the wood, a sound that muffled the shrill voices of the other maids in the kitchen, their laughter and whispers that always seemed to carry her name like a curse. She paid them no mind. She had learned that indifference was a form of resistance, a more effective armor than any reply. Her body moved with a contained grace, an economy of gestures that made her seem like a ballerina rehearsing in the dark. But inside, every muscle was tense, a lute string stretched to its limit, always waiting for the touch that would make it vibrate with fear or pain. The presence of Lady Beatrice was like a draught of cold air, even when she wasn't in the same room. Ilara felt her approach in the stiffening of the other's shoulders, in the sudden silence that fell over the hustle and bustle. Beatrice, with her silk dresses that hissed like serpents on the polished floor and her perfume of jasmine and cruelty, was the personification of that castle, beautiful, cold, and unattainable. Her eyes, of frigid blue, measured the world by its usefulness, and Ilara, to her, was less than an object. She was a stain on the perfection of her home, a constant reminder of the forced charity of her cousin, the master of the castle. And it was this master, Lord Alaric, whom Ilara feared most, though she had never seen him. His absence was an even more overwhelming presence. He was a legend, a name whispered in tones of reverence and dread, the hero of the Southern Wars, the man who had returned different, shrouded in shadows and silence. His portrait hung over the main fireplace, a dark oil painting that barely revealed the features of his face, but captured the intensity of a gaze that seemed to pierce the canvas and the soul. They said he spent his days locked in his wing, that his footsteps made no sound, that his voice, rarely heard, was like the distant thunder that announces a storm. Ilara cleaned the frame of that portrait with an almost religious care, her fingers trembling as they neared the painted face. She felt the weight of that gaze even in the paint. And she wondered what kind of man inspired so much fear and, at the same time, such fierce loyalty. The castle was his, the air they breathed was his, and she, a dry leaf in the wind, existed under his invisible suzerainty. That day, however, the air was different. There was a contained electricity, an expectation that made the dust dance faster in the sunbeams. Lady Beatrice's orders were sharper, her impatience more palpable. Kyle marched through the corridors with a furrowed brow, his boots marking the floor with a sombre urgency. Something was about to happen. The Lord was returning from his annual hunt in the mountains. The news spread like wildfire, a murmur that ran through the castle's bowels, from the bustling kitchen to the silent stables. Elara felt her heart stumble in her chest. A wave of cold ran down her spine, more intense than the draught from the window. The ghost from the portrait was about to become flesh and blood. And she, who had become a master of being invisible, felt a primal fear of being, for the first time, seen. She clutched the cloth in her hand, the cold wood of the table under her fingers, and prayed not to a god she no longer believed in, but to the shadows themselves, to swallow her and keep her safe. Lord Alaric's arrival was not announced by trumpets or fanfare, but by a sudden quiet that fell over Blackstone. The wind seemed to hold its breath, the barking of the dogs in the kennels ceased, and even the crackling of the fire in the hearth became a timid whisper. It was an absence of sound that became the most powerful of presences. Elara was in the upper gallery, cleaning the stone parapet overlooking the main courtyard, when she felt the change. The air grew denser, heavier, charged with something primal and untamable. She looked up, her heart hammering against her ribs like a prisoner against bars. A group of riders was entering the gate, their dark cloaks sprinkled with melting snow. And at their head, mounted on a steed as black as a starless night, was him. The distance and the mist rising from the ground conspired to blur his features, but the silhouette was unmistakable. It was the figure from the portrait, torn from the canvas and brought into the world with a dimension that paint could not capture. He moved with the fluidity of a predator, his body and the animals seeming like a single entity, sculpted from power and silence. Elara instinctively shrank back into the shadows of the gallery, her cold hands pressed to her mouth to stifle the breath that had become audible in her own ears. From her hidden position, she watched him dismount. He didn't jump. Rather, he seemed to flow from the saddle to the ground in a single graceful movement that belied his imposing stature. The servants rushed to tend to the horses, their heads bowed in submission. Lady Beatrice descended the stairs with a practiced smile, her bright red lips contrasting with the calculated pallor of her face. She greeted him with a curtsy, her voice a syrupy velvet that did not reach her eyes. He merely inclined his head, a minimal, almost imperceptible gesture. There were no words, no exchange, just the weight of his presence filling the courtyard, dominating everything. Elara couldn't look away. He removed his leather gloves, and the movement of his long, strong fingers was the only thing that seemed alive and warm in that scene of stone and coldness. He ran his hand over the horse's neck, a caress that held a strange tenderness, an intimacy he had not shown to any person. And then, as if he felt the weight of a gaze upon him, he raised his face. For an instant that stretched into an eternity, his eyes swept the castle's facade and locked onto the darkness of the gallery where Elara hid. She froze. The air left her lungs. It wasn't possible that he had seen her, a blur of shadow against the dark stone. But his gaze was like that of an eagle, piercing and absolute. They were not the eyes from the portrait. They were darker, deeper, and carried the glint of something ancient and hungry. She felt as if that look had physically touched her, a spear of ice that pierced her cloak of invisibility and exposed her trembling and vulnerable. Under the grey light of day, her heart skipped a beat, then raced in a mad dash. She huddled further against the cold wall, the sound of her own blood pulsing in her ears. He averted his gaze as suddenly as he had fixed it, turned, and entered the castle, his dark cloak dragging on the stone floor like the wing of a giant crow. Elara remained motionless for a long time, her body trembling uncontrollably. That brief instant had left her bare. He had seen her, she had no doubt, And in that look there was no curiosity or surprise. There was recognition, as if he had been expecting her, as if he knew she would be there watching. The idea was as terrifying as it was fascinating. In the days that followed, the castle's routine was transformed. Alaric's presence was an invisible axis around which everything revolved. He was rarely seen. He remained in his chambers in the West Wing, a part of the castle where not even Beatrice dared to enter without being summoned. But his energy permeated every stone. The silence was deeper, the whispers more cautious. Elara moved with redoubled care, her body a fine-tuned sensor for the slightest change in the atmosphere. She felt his proximity before any visible sign. It was a change in the air's temperature, a subtle vibration in the stone floor, the smell of ozone that precedes a lightning strike. One evening, late, when the castle was plunged into the stillness of midnight, she was sent to the library to fetch a book for Lady Beatrice, who was suffering from insomnia. The library was her refuge, but that night it felt different. The shadows were longer, denser. The fireplace was lit, an anomaly as Kyle insisted on extinguishing them to save wood. The fire cast dancing reflections on the spines of the books, making them seem to breathe. And then she saw him. He was standing by one of the high windows, his back to the entrance, watching the snow that had begun to fall, large, silent flakes accumulating on the windowsill. He was dressed in black, a simple linen shirt and dark trousers, and the absence of his formal attire made him seem even more imposing, more real. Elara stopped at the door, her heart in her throat. She should retreat, disappear before he noticed her presence. But her feet seemed rooted to the floor. She was mesmerized by the scene, the man of shadow against the ghostly whiteness of the night. The silence in the room was so profound she could hear the soft sound of the snow touching the glass. Without turning, he spoke. His voice was as she had imagined, yet different. It was deeper, a baritone that vibrated in the air with a timbre of gravel and melancholy. "What are you looking for at this hour, little bird?" The question hit her like a physical wave. He hadn't turned. How did he know it was her? How did he know someone was there? The nickname, Little Bird, was so unexpected, so intimately mocking, that it left her speechless. Her breath caught. She tried to form a response, but her throat was dry, the words refusing to come out. She just stood there, a statue of fear and fascination, as he continued to watch the silent dance of the snow. The fireplace crackled, a sudden punctuation in the tense silence, and Elara felt, with terrifying clarity, that this man saw much more than his eyes could reach. He saw the tremor in her hands, the fear in her heart, and for some unknown reason he didn't seem to mind. Or worse, he seemed to delight in it. The nickname hung in the air, a plume of smoke that refused to dissipate. Little Bird. The word disarmed her more than any command or threat. It was a soft sound, almost a caress, but coming from him, it held the weight of a cage. Elara finally found a wisp of a voice, a fragile sound that was barely a whisper. "Lady Beatrice." "She wishes for a book, my lord." She kept her eyes down, fixed on the floorboards, feeling the heat of the fire on one side of her face and the cold emanating from his presence on the other. Alaric didn't move. The silence that followed was a test, an empty space he invited her to fill with her fear. She could feel his scrutiny on her back, a physical weight that made her want to shrink until she disappeared. "Beatrice and her sleepless nights," he murmured, more to himself than to her. His voice held a note of weariness, a tired familiarity that revealed worlds of history between him and his cousin. "She reads so as not to think." "And what do you read to forget?" The question was a blade sliding gently between her ribs. Direct, intimate, impossible. How could he know she read? That she took refuge in stolen stories in furtive moments? Panic rose in her throat, cold and bitter. She couldn't confess. It would be admitting to theft, a transgression of Kale and Beatrice's strict rules. I do not read, my lord. I only clean the books." The lie came out trembling, a dry leaf scraping the floor. She hated herself for the weakness in her voice. He finally turned. The movement was slow, deliberate. The firelight danced across the planes of his face, carving shadows under his high cheekbones and in the curve of his mouth. He was more devastatingly handsome and dangerous than the portrait could ever suggest. His eyes, dark as the forest at night, locked onto hers, and she couldn't look away. There was no anger in his gaze, but something far more disturbing. A dark amusement, an ancient knowledge. "You lie," he said, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. "But you lie well. There is a certain poetry in your hesitation." He took a step toward her, and Elara instinctively recoiled, her heel gently hitting the doorframe. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a minimal curve that did not reach his eyes. "Do not be afraid. The books do not tell secrets, at least not yours." He approached the nearest shelf, his long, pale fingers sliding over the leather spines with a familiarity that was almost sensual. He seemed to know each volume by touch. What poison has Beatrice chosen for tonight? A romance of impossible loves or the biography of a martyred saint? She oscillates between the two. Elara swallowed, forcing herself to remember the title Beatrice had given her. The Meditations of Saint Elara. "My lord." As she said her own name, a shiver ran through her body. A cruel coincidence. Alaric stopped, his hand hovering over a book. He turned to her again, and this time the amusement in his eyes was replaced by a piercing intensity. "Elara," he repeated the name, and in his mouth it sounded like something entirely new, a rediscovered word. "A saint who renounced the world for a divine love. An ironic choice for my cousin." His eyes roamed over her, from head to toe as if he were reading her, deciphering every layer of her frayed dress, every tremor of her hands. "And you? Would you renounce the world for love?" The question made her dizzy. It was a game, she realized, a cruel and intimate game whose rules she did not know. She didn't answer, unable to form a single word. Her whole life had been a renunciation not by choice but by lack of it. Love was a word from a language she barely remembered hearing. He didn't wait for an answer. He pulled a heavy volume from the shelf and walked toward her, stopping so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Smell the subtle scent of leather, snow, and something else. Something metallic and clean like cold rain. She could see the gentle pulse of a vein in his neck, the detail of a small white scar near his temple. "Take this to her," he said, holding out the book. Their hands touched as she took the volume. His skin was cold, a surprising cold that contrasted with the warmth she had felt moments before. The touch was brief, a flash of lightning, but it sent a shock through her body that left her breathless. Their fingers brushed, and for an instant she thought he would hold her. But he drew his hand back. His eyes, however, held her captive. "Go now, little bird. The night is long, and saints can be tedious company." Elara turned and practically fled, the heavy book pressed against her chest like a shield. She didn't look back, but she felt his gaze on her back with every step, a burning coal that seared through the fabric of her dress. When she handed the book to Lady Beatrice, her hands were still shaking. Beatrice dismissed her with a disdainful wave, already absorbed in her reading. Elara retreated into the darkness of the corridors, her heart a confusion of fear and a new, terrifying emotion she dared not name. That night, in her cold room, she couldn't sleep. The sensation of his cold touch lingered on her skin, a phantom mark. His voice echoed in her mind the word little bird and the impossible question. He had seen her. He had read her. And instead of crushing her under the weight of his authority, he had played with her. And the most frightening part, the part that made her tremble under the thin blankets, was that a part of her, a dark and rebellious part, wanted to play too. The winter deepened, enveloping Blackstone in a white, suffocating silence. Snow covered the battlements and softened the hard contours of the castle, transforming it into a sleeping giant. For Elara, the days became a palette of greys and whites, the outside world a blur seen through windows fogged by the cold. Life within the walls, however, had become sharper, more dangerous. Since the encounter in the library, the silent dynamic between her and Lord Alaric had transformed into an invisible web of tension and awareness. He did not seek her out again, but his presence was a constant on her periphery. She felt him before she saw him. A corridor seemed narrower when he crossed it at the other end. The air in the great dining hall seemed thinner when he sat at the head of the table eating in silence, oblivious to everyone except, she felt, her. Their eyes never met directly, but she felt the weight of his gaze on her when she thought no one was looking. It was a constant, patient scrutiny, like a hunter watching his prey, deciding the right moment to strike. And this knowledge kept her in a state of perpetual alertness, every nerve on edge. Her sensitivity, once a curse that made her vulnerable to the court's slights, was now her only defense. She learned to read the castle's atmosphere like a text, to predict the movements of its inhabitants by the subtle change in the air currents. This did not go unnoticed by Lady Beatrice. Her feminine intuition, sharpened by envy and ambition, sensed the change before she could name it. She began to watch. Elara with a new intensity, her cold blue eyes searching for the source of that new spark of defiance she perceived in the young maid. The defiance was not in words or actions, but in the way Elara now carried her shoulders a little less stooped, in the way her gaze, though still evasive, no longer broke so easily. Humiliation, once an effective weapon, now seemed to glance off something more resilient within her. One day, during a formal lunch, a rare occasion that Alaric honoured with his presence, Beatrice decided to test this new resistance. The room was filled with local nobles, minor vassals who came to pay homage and warm themselves by Blackstone's power. Elara served the wine, moving silently behind the chairs, her face a mask of neutrality. As she reached a portly, red-faced baron, he seized her wrist, the gesture crude and possessive. "Well, well, Beatrice," the baron said, his voice thick with wine. "Where do you hide such delicate creatures? This one has the frightened look of a doe." Laughter rumbled around the table. Elara froze, the heat of his hand on her wrist a violation that made her feel sullied. Fear, familiar and paralyzing, rose in her throat. She looked at Beatrice, waiting for the intervention she knew would not come. The lady of the castle smiled, a thin, cruel smile. "Be careful, Baron Valerius. Arduz can bite. She is a wild thing my cousin insists on keeping. One of his charity projects." The word wild was spoken with a sharp clarity designed for everyone to hear. The humiliation was public, calculated. Elara felt the blood rush to her face, a wave of heat and shame. She tried to pull her arm away, but the baron's grip tightened. The laughter continued, and each sound was a small needle in her skin. She closed her eyes for an instant, transporting herself to the silent safety of the library, to the smell of old paper and the promise of other worlds. When she opened them, her gaze, against her will, flew to the head of the table. Lord Alaric had not moved. He was leaning back in his chair, watching the scene with a terrifying calm. One hand rested on the table, his fingers drumming softly, a slow, deliberate rhythm, the only sign of life in his still figure. His eyes were not on Elara, nor on the Baron. They were fixed on his cousin Beatrice, and in them there was a cold that would make the winter outside seem like a mild spring. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The drumming of his fingers was the only sound in the room now, each tap a nail in the coffin of the laughter and mockery. The silence became heavy, uncomfortable. Baron Valerius, sensing the change in atmosphere, released Elara's wrist as if it burned. He cleared his throat, his face red now for a different reason. Beatrice forced a smile, but it trembled on her lips. The power in the room had shifted, recentered on its silent master. Alaric raised his goblet, a slow, regal gesture. "A toast," he said, his voice a dark velvet that covered the entire room. "To wild creatures. They remind us that civilization is but a thin layer of ice over a dark, deep river." He drank, his eyes still on Beatrice, a silent challenge, a warning. And then his gaze moved and met Elara's. For a second, his mask of coldness seemed to crack, and she saw something there. Something that wasn't pity, but a dark recognition. A complicity. He had saved her. Not out of kindness, she knew. It was a demonstration of power, a reminder to everyone in the room, especially Beatrice, of who the true master of Blackstone was, and that Elara, the wild thing, the delicate creature, was, for some inscrutable reason, his. The revelation hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was not just a maid. She was a piece in his game. A pawn, perhaps, or something more. She backed away from the table, her heart beating erratically, and retreated into the shadows of the hallway where she could breathe. The humiliation still burned, but it was now mixed with something more complex. An electrifying fear and a strange, dangerous sense of belonging. She was his to protect or to destroy. And she didn't know which of the two fates was more terrifying. Alaric's silent intervention during the dinner marked a turning point. It wasn't an act of kindness. Ilara understood that with a painful clarity, but a declaration of ownership. She was a territory he had marked, and no one else was allowed to tread upon it. This realization did not free her. On the contrary, it caged her in a new form of captivity, more subtle and infinitely more complex. Beatrice's public humiliations ceased, replaced by a cold, vigilant hostility. The other maids, sensing the shift in power, now treated her with a mixture of fear and resentment, isolating her in a silence that was even heavier than the previous insults. She had become a taboo, an anomaly that no one knew how to classify. Her only refuge remained the library, but even that sanctuary was now charged with the memory of his presence. Every shadow seemed to hold his form. Every draught of air seemed to whisper his mocking nickname. One afternoon, while dusting the celestial globes in the farthest corner of the library, a door she had always thought was locked creaked open. It was a narrow spiral staircase leading up. Curiosity, a force she thought had been crushed long ago, propelled her inside. The air on the staircase was cold and carried the scent of dried herbs and beeswax. At the top, there was a single room, an observatory. The ceiling was a dome of glass and bronze, now covered in snow but which clearly opened to the sky. A massive brass telescope dominated the center of the room, pointed toward the darkness of the ceiling. Star charts covered the walls, and the tables were cluttered with navigational instruments, astrolabes, and astronomy books. It was the Wolf's Den, Alaric's private sanctuary. Ilara knew immediately she had made a terrible mistake. This place was sacred, intimate. His presence was imbued in every object, in the scent of the place, in the meticulous order of the maps. This was where he took refuge from the world, from his own castle. This was where he looked at the sky, perhaps searching for something he had lost on Earth. She was about to retreat, her heart pounding with panic, when her eyes fell on a small leather-bound notebook open on a desk. It wasn't a star chart. It was a logbook, but the entries were not of stars. They were drawings. With a trembling hand, she approached. The pages were filled with charcoal sketches made with a skilled and precise hand. There were drawings of desolate landscapes, ruins of castles in distant lands, faces of soldiers with empty eyes. They were the memories of his war. And then she saw it. On a separate page, a single drawing. It was a face. Her face. He had drawn her in profile, her gaze lost, her mouth slightly parted as if she were about to speak or sigh. He had captured her in a moment of distraction, perhaps in the garden, perhaps in the library itself. The precision of the details was frightening. He had recorded the way a stray lock of hair escaped her braid, the gentle curve of her neck, the shadow beneath her cheekbone. He had studied her, memorized her features with an intensity that made her dizzy. The air seemed to thin. She touched the paper with her fingertips, half expecting the drawing to dissolve, to be a mirage. But it was real. Tangible proof of his silent obsession. That drawing was more intimate than a touch, more revealing than any word. It was the crack in his icy facade, the revelation that behind the feudal lord and the dark warrior, there was an observer, an artist, a man who saw her in a way no one else did. A sound behind her made her jump, her heart leaping to her throat. She spun around. Alaric was standing at the entrance to the stairs, watching her. His face was an inscrutable mask, but his eyes burned. There was no surprise in his gaze, just a lethal calm. He had caught her red-handed, invading his most secret space, discovering his most well-kept secret. The silence in the observatory was absolute. The only sound was Ilara's ragged breathing and the distant howl of the wind outside. She couldn't tear her eyes from his, caught in a beam of fear and fascination. She expected anger, an explosion of fury at her transgression, but he just tilted his head, a faint ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I see you've found my hobby," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Do you like what you see, little bird?" He walked slowly into the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded like the shutting of a trap. He didn't look at the notebook. His eyes remained fixed on her. Every man has his weaknesses. Some collect coins. Others lands. I collect moments of beauty amidst the ugliness. He stopped a few steps from her, so close she could see the silver and onyx rings on his fingers. "You are a beautiful piece of melancholy, Ilara. a poem written in flesh and blood. The confession was as poetic as it was terrifying. He saw her not as a person, but as an object of art, a curiosity to be studied and captured. The revelation drained her of fear, replacing it with a wave of cold anger. For the first time, she found her voice. Not a whisper, but a clear, firm sound. "I am not one of your collections, my lord." Alaric raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised by her audacity. A slow admiration lightened the darkness in his eyes. "No?" he asked, his tone a gentle challenge. "Then what are you?" He reached out, not to touch her, but to turn the page of the notebook, revealing another drawing. It was her again, this time sleeping, or at least with her eyes closed, her face serene. The image was so intimate it made her blush violently. How could he have— "You are a mystery," he continued, his voice now a low, hypnotic murmur. "A bird with a broken wing that refuses to admit it cannot fly. And that, my dear Elara, is the rarest and most captivating form of beauty there is." He was close enough for her to feel his breath on her forehead. He raised his hand and with the tip of his finger, traced the line of her jaw, a touch as light as a feather. Yet it set every nerve in her body on fire. "And I intend to discover all your secrets." The touch was the spark that lit the powder. The world seemed to stop, time contracting in that single gesture. Fear and anger merged into something new, something that was dangerously close to desire. And in that small observatory at the top of the world, under a glass sky covered in snow, Elara knew she was irremediably lost. His touch was not an attack, but a seal, a brand that burned on her skin long after he removed his hand. The observatory, once a haven of stars, had become a confession chamber, a space where the masks had fallen, revealing the predator and the prey in their most primal dance. Elara did not flee. Her feet were nailed to the floor, and a strange calm descended upon her, the resignation of one who finally faces the inevitable. That touch, so light and yet so heavy with meaning, had changed everything. There was no going back to being the invisible maid. He had claimed her not with words, but with that gesture, and his gaze promised that it was only the beginning. In the days that followed, a new routine was established, not imposed by orders but by a tacit understanding. He began to summon her, not for servile tasks, but for her silent company. Sometimes, in the library, he would read aloud passages of ancient poetry, his voice a dark river that enveloped her, while she sat across the room pretending to mend a piece of linen. He didn't look at her, but the words were clearly for her, hand-picked, full of metaphors of captive moons and fallen stars. Other times, he would call her to the observatory. He would show her the constellations on the maps, naming stars in dead languages, explaining the movements of the planets with a cold, intellectual passion. He taught her how to use the telescope, guiding her hands over the cold brass, his proximity a torment and a blessing. During these moments, they rarely spoke of anything personal. The universe had become their intermediary, a vast and safe field of conversation where they could meet without touching. But the tension was always there, a subtext in every word, a thread stretched taut between them. Elara felt as if she were walking a tightrope over an abyss. On the one hand, there was the fascination with this man, with his brilliant mind and his wounded soul, which she glimpsed in the drawings and the poetry he chose. He saw her, understood her in a way no one ever had. He gave her knowledge, treated her as an intellectual equal, a gift more precious than any jewel. On the other hand, there was the constant fear. He was her lord, her captor. His kindness was a gilded cage, his attention a velvet chain. She was at the mercy of his whims, and the intensity of his interest in her was as possessive as it was protective. The antagonists, Beatrice and Kyle, watched this new dynamic with venom in their eyes. Prevented from attacking her directly, they resorted to more subtle methods. Impossible tasks were assigned to her, designed for her to fail and incur Alaric's wrath. Small belongings of hers disappeared from her room. Malicious rumors about her and the lord of the castle were planted like poisonous seeds among the servants, ensuring her complete ostracism. Elara endured it all in silence. Their cruelties seemed small and insignificant compared to the emotional turmoil Alaric had created within her. She was trapped between gratitude and resentment, between the desire to flee and the inexplicable will to stay. The central conflict had become internal. It was her vulnerability against his power, but also her nascent strength against her own attraction to him. She wanted her freedom, but what did it mean to be free if it meant leaving him? The thought brought a void that terrified her. One thawing night, when the sound of dripping water from the eaves was the only sound in the castle, he called her to the stables. Spring was coming, a hesitant harbinger in the milder air. He was standing beside his black steed, brushing the animal's mane with long, rhythmic strokes. The smell of horse hay and leather filled the air. "His name is Shadow," Alaric said without turning. "He trusts me, but he doesn't like anyone else." He held out the brush to her. "Try." Ilara hesitated. The horse was a magnificent beast of muscle and power, its eyes dark and intelligent. She approached slowly, holding out her hand for the animal to smell her. The horse snorted but didn't back away. Under Alaric's watchful eye, she began to brush the silky mane. The rhythm of the movement was calming. "You're not afraid of him," Alaric observed, his voice low. "No. He is honest in his strength," she replied, surprising herself with the answer. "He doesn't pretend to be what he is not." The implication hung in the air between them. Alaric stopped moving and faced her, his face in the dim light of the stable. "And I? Do I pretend to be what I am not?" "I don't know what you are, my lord," she confessed. Her voice little more than a whisper, but her eyes did not stray from his. He took a step toward her, his body blocking the little light that entered. "I am what you make of me, Ilara," he said, his voice hoarse. "Your jailer or your protector? Your master or—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. He raised his hand and touched her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her lower lip. The gesture was inquisitive, a silent question. The horse Shadow neighed softly, as if sensing the unbearable tension. And in that moment, in the silence of the stable, with the smell of the imminent spring in the air, Ilara closed her eyes and leaned into his touch. A surrender that was also her own form of power. She didn't know if she was falling in love with a man or a shadow, a savior or her captor. Perhaps he was both. And perhaps she was both too, the prisoner and the key to her own cell. The acceptance of his touch was a boundary crossed. In the silence of the stable, something broke and was remade in a new and dangerous way. From that moment on, the dynamic between them shifted from an intellectual tension to a restrained physical intimacy. A dance of approaches and retreats that was even more maddening. His touches were rare and fleeting, but charged with an electricity that left her breathless. The brush of his fingers against hers when passing her a book, his hand on her back to guide her through a dark corridor. A gesture that seemed protective but was, above all, possessive. Each touch was a reminder that she belonged to him. Spring arrived in full, thawing the earth and bringing an explosion of life to the gardens of Blackstone. Under the pretext that the fresh air would do her good, Alaric began to take her on silent walks through the castle grounds. They didn't talk much. They walked side by side, the distance between them always the same, an invisible border of respect and desire. He showed her the rare flowers his mother had planted, naming each one with a delicacy that contrasted with his dark persona. In those hours, under the pale spring sun, Ilara glimpsed the man he might have been before the war, before the shadows claimed him. She saw a man capable of tenderness, a man who loved beauty in its most fragile forms. And these glimpses were dangerous, for they made her forget the abyss that separated them. They made her wish for the impossible. The pressure from Beatrice and Chaol, however, did not diminish. On the contrary, Ilara's growing closeness to Alaric made them more desperate. They knew they were losing their grip on the lord of the castle, and they saw Ilara as the cause of their waning influence. They needed to remove her, and they needed to do it in a way that Alaric could not prevent. The opportunity arose with the arrival of an emissary from the king, an elderly and austere duke named Theron, who came to discuss border issues and taxes. His visit required a formal reception, a banquet that would bring together all the nobility of the region. It was the perfect stage for their plan. In the days leading up to the banquet, Beatrice adopted a strangely friendly attitude toward Ilara. She entrusted her with the task of overseeing the decoration of the great hall. Praising her delicate taste, she gave her a dress for the occasion, a simple but elegant one of dark green velvet, saying it was improper for the Lord's protégé to look like a beggar. Ilara was suspicious of the sudden kindness, but she had no way to refuse. The trap was being set with exquisite precision, and she was being forced to walk right into it. On the night of the banquet, the great hall of Blackstone was resplendent. Chandeliers dripped golden light onto the lavish tables, and the walls were adorned with tapestries and garlands of fresh flowers. The local nobility displayed their silks and jewels, their voices and laughter filling the space. Ilara, in her new dress, felt like an imposter. She had been instructed by Beatrice to remain near the main table, to serve wine directly to Alaric and Duke Theron. It was a prominent position, designed to expose her. Alaric, seated in his high-backed chair, seemed more distant and regal than ever. He barely glanced at her as she filled his goblet, his face an impenetrable mask. Duke Theron, for his part, observed her with a cold curiosity. The banquet proceeded, a theatre of etiquette and power, and then, at the height of the evening, Kyle approached the main table, his face a mask of false concern. He bowed to Alaric but spoke loudly enough for everyone around to hear. "My lord, forgive the interruption, but something of great value has gone missing. Lady Beatrice's sapphire brooch, an heirloom from her mother." A murmur went through the room. Beatrice brought a hand to her chest, her face a picture of perfectly rehearsed shock and anguish. Alaric stared at her, his eyes narrowed. "Search for it," he said, his voice cold. Kyle hesitated, casting a significant glance at Ilara. "We already have, my lord." "And we found this." He opened his hand. On his palm, glittering in the candlelight, was a small silver button, identical to those on the dress Ilara was wearing. It was found on the floor of Lady Beatrice's chamber, near her jewellery box. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy as a shroud. All eyes turned to Ilara. The accusation was clear, the evidence perfectly planted. It was her word against that of the loyal steward and the lady of the house. She was the outsider, the orphan, the maid with a history of silent transgressions. No one would doubt her guilt. She looked at Beatrice, who was staring at her with ill-disguised triumph. She looked at Kyle, whose face was a mask of hypocritical justice. And then she looked at Alaric. His expression was unreadable. He was looking at her not as a judge, but as a scientist observing a chemical reaction. What would she do? Scream? Cry? Deny it? Her fate was in his hands. The climax of their drama would not be in a secret observatory or a dark stable, but here, under the gaze of 100 witnesses. "Ilara," said Duke Theron, his voice grave and judgmental. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Ilara opened her mouth, but no sound came out. What could she say? Any word would be twisted, used against her. Fear and despair paralyzed her. She was cornered, the trap had sprung. She bowed her head, defeat a bitter taste in her mouth. And then, Alaric's voice cut through the silence, calm and lethal. "She needs to say nothing." Alaric's words fell into the silence of the hall like stones on a frozen pond, shattering the surface and sending shockwaves in every direction. He did not raise his voice, but the authority in it was absolute, unquestionable. He rose slowly, his towering height dominating the scene. All eyes, previously fixed on Ilara, were now locked on him. He did not look at Ilara. Instead, his cold, piercing gaze moved from Kale to Beatrice, and there it remained. "A silver button," he said, his voice dangerously soft. He took the button from Kyle's hand, examining it between his thumb and forefinger. Quite convenient evidence, especially considering that this dress, he gestured toward Ilara without looking at her, was a gift from Lady Beatrice. I imagine she supervised the sewing herself. The implication was a slap in Beatrice's face. Her face, once a picture of rehearsed anguish, turned pale, the colour draining from her lips. She opened her mouth to protest, but Alaric raised a hand, silencing her. "But let us for a moment entertain this farce," he continued, walking slowly around the table until he stood behind Beatrice. He placed his hands on her shoulders. a gesture that might seem comforting to a stranger, but which Alara recognized as a veiled threat, the grip of a claw. "My cousin," Beatrice stammered. You would never what, Beatrice?" he interrupted, his voice a murmur in her ear that everyone in the quiet room could hear. "Never underestimate my intelligence? Or never realize that patience, like all things, has an end?" He moved away from her and walked to the center of the open space, the silver button still between his fingers. "The sapphire brooch. A beautiful piece. I remember my aunt, your mother, wearing it. She always said the sapphires reminded her of my father's eyes, the brother she adored." He paused and looked at Duke Theron. "A curious sentiment, don't you think, Duke? Considering my father had brown eyes." A collective gasp swept through the hall. Beatrice's lie had been exposed with surgical precision. She didn't know the history behind the jewel she claimed to cherish so much. Alaric let the revelation hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "The brooch was not stolen," he said, his voice now resonating with an icy power. "I took it. This morning." He opened his other hand. There, nestled in his palm, was the sapphire brooch, gleaming with a cold blue light. He had taken it as bait, knowing they would bite. He had anticipated their plan. Beatrice made a strangled sound, a mixture of shock and horror. Kyle took a step back, his face ashen. Alaric turned to Alara. For the first time that night, he looked directly at her, and in his eyes, she saw a contained hurricane of protective fury. "Alara stole nothing," he said, his voice now a low thunder. "But she is guilty of a far more serious crime in the eyes of some in this room." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the shocked faces of the nobility. "She is guilty of possessing honesty, of having a quiet strength that threatens those who build themselves on lies and intrigue. She is guilty of being a mirror, and some of us do not like what we see reflected in it." He walked to Alara, who remained paralyzed, her heart beating uncontrollably. He stopped in front of her, his immense figure a shield between her and the rest of the world. And then he did something that no one, not even Alara in her wildest dreams, could have predicted. He knelt before the entire court, his vassals, the king's emissary, Lord Alaric of Blackstone, the feared warrior, the silent master, bent one knee before an orphan maid. The gesture was so shocking, so subversive, that the entire hall held its breath. He took her hand. His skin was cold, but his grip was firm, anchoring her to the surreal reality of that moment. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, an act of feudal devotion, an oath of loyalty that was both a coronation. "Forgive me," he whispered. The words for her alone, but the gesture for the entire world. "Forgive me for bringing you into this viper's nest. I swear that from this day forward, no viper will dare approach you again." He stood, still holding her hand, and turned to the stunned crowd. "This woman," he declared, his voice echoing in the rafters, "is under my direct protection. Any offense against her is an offense against me. Anyone who questions her honor questions mine. Is that clear?" It was not a question. It was a decree. Alara's destiny had been altered. Not by a confession, but by a public and powerful intervention that elevated her from the dust to a pedestal. She was no longer the maid. She was the Lord's protégé, his untouchable. The power in the room had irrevocably reconfigured. Beatrice was broken, Kyle ruined. And Alara, standing beside Alaric, her hand still in his, felt both exalted and terrified. He had saved her, but in doing so, he had bound her to him with chains of gold, in plain sight of all. The silent war was over, but a new, perhaps more dangerous one, was just beginning. The banquet ended not with music, but with the jarring sound of silence. The guests hastily departed, their faces a mixture of shock, fear, and gossipy excitement. Beatrice was escorted to her chambers, a deposed queen whose court had dissolved into whispers. Kyle simply vanished into the shadows, swallowed by his own disgrace. In the great hall, now nearly empty, only Alara and Alaric remained, standing amidst the chaos of abandoned plates and goblets. Her hand was still in his, a warm, real connection in a world that had become dreamlike. The candle flames flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that turned the hall into a stage after the play had ended. Alaric finally released her hand, and the sudden loss of contact made her feel cold. He didn't look at her. instead walking to the large window that overlooked the night, his hands clasped behind his back. The full moon bathed the castle grounds in a silvery, ghostly light. "I should have acted sooner," he said, his voice low, stripped of its earlier fury, now just tired. I underestimated her. Her capacity for cruelty. "You couldn't have known," Elara whispered, finding her own voice. "I always know," he replied, a touch of his old arrogance returning. "I just choose to ignore it. It's easier." He turned to her, his face in the half-light. "But not with you. With you, ignoring is not an option." The confession hung in the air, more intimate than the kiss on her hand. He was placing her at the center of his world, admitting she was the variable that altered all his equations. She took a hesitant step toward him. "Why?" she asked, the question that had been burning inside her since their first meeting in the library. "Why me?" Alaric smiled, a genuinely melancholic smile this time. "Because you are the only person in this castle who wants nothing from me. Everyone else sees my title, my lands, my power. You see?" "Me?" He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of frustration. "You look at me as if I were just a man, and that is terrifying and addictive. You remind me of a part of myself I thought I had buried on foreign battlefields." He moved closer to her, the space between them shrinking until only a breath separated them. He raised his hand but hesitated before touching her face. "And I brought you into danger because of my selfishness. I kept you here because your silence was the only music I could bear. Because your sadness was a mirror to my own." Elara's world spun. The story she had constructed in her mind, of the captor and the captive, the predator and the prey, crumbled, revealing a much more complex and painful truth. He didn't see her as a collection. He saw her as an equal, a companion in his self-imposed exile. The vulnerability in his voice disarmed her completely. The fear she felt for him dissolved, replaced by an overwhelming wave of empathy, of an understanding that transcended words. He was a prisoner too, chained to his own power, his own history. She raised her hand and touched his face, the gesture mirroring what he had done to her so many times. The stubble of his beard scratched her soft skin. He closed his eyes at her touch, a giant surrendering. "You are not alone," she whispered, and the words were a balm, a promise. He opened his eyes, and the darkness in them had been replaced by a soft light, a vulnerability that made her want to protect him from the world, from himself. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of possession or overwhelming passion. It was a kiss of recognition. Slow, tender, full of a shared sadness and the bittersweet beauty of two broken souls meeting in the darkness. He tasted of wine, of winter, and of regret. She responded with the hunger of a lifetime of loneliness, her hands rising to tangle in his hair, pulling him closer. In that kiss, power dissolved. There was no longer lord and maid, only a man and a woman, finding a momentary refuge from the world's pain in each other's arms. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. The reality of what they had done, of what they had become, descended upon them. Her status had changed, but the complexity of their situation had only deepened. What would come next? She was his protégée, but after that kiss, how could they go back to being just that? The ending was not a clear redemption, but the beginning of a new chapter, more uncertain and bittersweet than the last. They were bound now, not by decree or duty, but by an emotional connection that was both a safe harbor and a gathering storm. He had saved her from the world, but who would save them from each other? Outside, the silver moon continued its silent vigil, guarding the secrets of a castle where a wild rose had finally bloomed in the cold stone, its fragrance a mixture of pain and promise, a bittersweet reminder that even in the darkest nights, beauty can find a way to be born. If this story found a mirror in your soul, leave your comment and share. Sometimes what hurts us most is what makes us most human.